Yes, I am. Yes, I am.
Time has
Hello, friends. Welcome to the second episode of Radio Free Cannabis. Today's episode is going to be on the ways that cannabis may be able to prevent and treat COVID. The theme for the show reflects an evolution in my own thinking. When COVID first hit, I was mainly concerned with making sure that cannabis was going to be declared to be an essential product so that we'd be able to continue serving our patients and our clients here in California in my own business, Harborside. And then shortly after that, really thinking about how we can most safely do that, fulfill that mandate as an essential business and make sure that our staff and our clients are as safe as they possibly can be when doing cannabis transactions. So that was really where my focus was in the first week or two. Uh, but it wasn't long before I started seeing posts about CBD, and posts talking about how CBD could supposedly prevent COVID or treat COVID. And when I first saw the posts, being very familiar with how promotional the CBD branch of the cannabis industry has become and how many claims have been attached to CBD without a whole lot of scientific backing for them. I was initially skeptical, and even in my own mind, I was a little bit skeptical. But there was this little voice in the back of my head that said, Steve, knowing what we know about cannabis, it probably is useful for COVID. But I pretty much ignored that voice for another week or so. And we can get into the reasons maybe why I ignored it until I saw the University of Alberta study come out. And this is a study that came out several weeks ago that identified particular strains of cannabis that seemed to show indications they might be effective for COVID. And when that came out, I started feeling a little bit chagrined that I hadn't been talking more about cannabis and COVID, because I remembered back to the AIDS crisis, which was really the crucible for modern medical cannabis. And this is the late 1980s in San Francisco and Washington, D.C., and other major cities, New York. And advocates like Dennis Perrone, Jack Herer, myself, started sharing cannabis with our friends who had AIDS, not because they were medical patients, but because they were our friends. And what we noticed was that the people who consumed cannabis seemed to have a higher quality of life and a longer longevity than people who weren't using cannabis, people who had AIDS that weren't using cannabis. So that really set me to thinking, and I started asking some questions. I started asking my friends and my associates whether they knew anybody who had been a regular consumer of cannabis who had experienced COVID, and if so, what those symptoms were like. And what I got back was very few people that I could identify who were regular cannabis consumers reported having COVID. And in the cases where they did report it, and there were some, they reported minor cases that didn't require hospitalization. Well, that in turn set me off trying to explore some research, see if there was some science here that would back up this early anecdotal indication, that would back up some of the other information that I'd seen. And I found a number of studies, which I myself am not really well qualified enough to dig down on them and make judgments about them, but I thought that they were really important to explore and share, and they convinced me that that it is time for a conversation. So I think the first thing I'd like to talk about with our guests, and let me just mention that all of our guests, Dr. Joe Rosado, Dr. Rachel Knox, and Dr. Sandra Carrillo are, when I've met thousands of cannabis doctors now. I've traveled all over the world. And there's a few of them who are not only just really exceptional medical professionals who are on the front lines of cannabis medicine, but also have a unique ability to be able to express their knowledge in ways that are accessible and understandable. And that's what you'll find from each of our guests today. They are the foremost cannabis doctors in the world. You can find their in-depth biographies and links to what they have going on the description of this podcast. And I think I'd like to start with you, Dr. Knox, and just sort of we could speak to this question that I was grappling with. Is it okay to have this conversation? Can we talk about cannabis and COVID? Are there upsides and downsides to that conversation?
Yeah. Yes, we can. We should.
Absolutely. Definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. A resounding yes. You know, as an endocannabinologist, I never really talk about cannabis in isolation or our phytocannabinoids in isolation. You know, we have to understand that in cannabis, we have this treasure trove of phytochemicals that are pharmacologically active. But not only that, we have to talk about our lifestyles and how we think, how we feel, what we eat, what relationships we're cultivating impact our immunology at the same time. So to zoom back in on cannabis, though, yeah, absolutely, we should be talking about it. Right now, we are seeing research emerge studying how cannabinoids, right, high CBD strains, for example, might be able to use, expressly in the acute setting. Do we know enough about how cannabinoid CBD downregulate receptors, that angiotensin, converting enzyme, the ACE2 receptor that seems to be helping the coronavirus, that SARS-CoV-2, grab a foothold and replicate? Will the downregulation of that receptor decrease infectability? Perhaps. We don't know quite yet to what degree, at what doses that might be reasonable or rational. Or let's take it a step further. The second phase of COVID-19, right, that severe phase that is representative of the cytokine storm, can we downregulate that hyperinflammatory reaction with our phytocannabinoids? We know how anti-inflammatory they are. The answer is probably yes, but again, at what doses? And does it make sense right now with what we know to usher that quickly into prime time when we still have a lot of questions left to answer? Now, one thing that you said that I thought was really remarkable and that we should hone in on is the use of cannabis preventatively. And that's where I think cannabis is ready for prime time. Cannabis and the phytocannabinoids there within are like adaptogens. They're helping boost our immune system. They're helping to fortify our bodies so that when we do come across a pathogen, like a viral pathogen, which is highly transmissible, all year round, like we're constantly transmitting viruses to one another, will our bodies be prepared to fend off that viral pathogen? Right. So I think that's what you were mentioning, you were speaking to, the ability of the bodies of the folks who casually or therapeutically are already consuming cannabis. And what we're now sort of starting to recognize, which is a decreased incidence of severe COVID-19 disease. So I think we're ready to have that conversation. Absolutely.
Joe Rosado.
Well, to dovetail what Dr. Knox has just stated, a wiser man than myself said an ounce of prevention is equal to a pound of cure. And so prevention is the key. And that's what I've been promoting, is the utilization of the phytocannabinoids, whole plant medicine, for building your immune system, but also addressing the anxiety and the stress that 100% of my patients are going through. We are still in practice, and because it has been deemed an essential business in the state of Florida, the medical dispensaries are open. And so they've created new innovative ways for patients to be able to get their medication, free delivery to anyone 65 years of age or older. They're having special hours available for immunocompromised patients. So they're really thinking outside of the box. The state of Florida has allowed for us to provide telemedicine for follow-up visits and recertification visits, so that we don't have to see them face to face in the same room the way the law reads, to avoid the possibility of any exposure. but 100% of our patients are dealing with stress, anxiety, not being able to work for the past 2.5, 3 months, businesses closed, restaurants closed, you know, not sure if they're going to be able to bounce back from this, you know. And so in conjunction with building up your immune system, stress is a great detriment to the immune system. And so by building up and maintaining a sense of peace, calm, and tranquility, or as Dr. Lumir Hanush talked about, the bliss, you know, that bliss, the anandamide, you know, being blissful and doing the best that we can under the circumstances that we're living in.
Great. Dr. Carrillo.
Yes, well, I agree completely with my colleagues, Dr. Knox and Dr. Rosado, and definitely in these moments, it is a worldwide crisis. We are all facing a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, and we've been seeing actually something so important that there is like a major pandemic that is right now obesity. In the States, the rates of obesity are very high, and we see the patients with this type of comorbidities, obesity and endocrinology problems, high blood pressure, they have a very high risk to contract the virus and to get complications. So at first, before talking to the plant, I talk about what Joseph and Rachel was saying, is first we have to balance our body. We have to balance our endocannabinoid tone, because all this unbalance is the one who can lead us to have all these comorbidities. So first of all, you need to know what you eat, how to eat your things. You need to supplement, and you need to use the endocannabinoid system as a dampening system to boost your immune system. So in these moments, it's very important not just to thinking in how to treat, but we also, as Joseph said, we need to prevent. And comorbidities like obesity, like obesity are the ones who are really killing these patients. So we have to think about that, and of course, and the benefits the cannabis has with anti-inflammation, with immunomodulations. So those are all topics, and it actually scientists all over the world right now doing research that we will be talking further. That right now they don't have the result, but I see that is very promising what they're doing, and the same way they're doing research with other type of medications. But for me, it's very exciting to be that cannabis again is being researched in this matter. We have Professor Dedi Meiri at the Technion Israel Institute. He is conducting right now two types of studies of research. One, to see what the properties of the plant to immunomodulate and reduce inflammation. And he is also checking about the ACE2 receptors. That is what Rachel was mentioning earlier, because we know that these viruses come through our body. Through the ACE2 receptors that we have located in our lungs, in our mucus, in our GI tract. So this is the gateway. And if we get to, and we are able to produce a modulation of all those ACE2 receptors, we can block or diminish the production of all these cytokines that I think we will be talking in the future of these conversations about the deepest part of research that has been done. But definitely it's a very important topic, and I see every day patients calling me, asking me, what should I do? Should I take should I continue my protocol of cannabis? Because I have rheumatoid arthritis, I have anxiety. So there is a lot of patients that they have their treatments since the very beginning with medical cannabis, and they get scared. They need to know, so they need reassurance of these situations. So it's very important, Steve, that you're giving the space to physicians and scientists to explore and explain. to the community. What are the things that are out there? And that is very important because I do see a lot of misinformation in media, and it's very scary because people can take that information and make mistakes. And we're talking about something so serious that is the COVID, that is for all of us unknown. We are all just learning how is this virus behaving. So I think it's very important to talk about this.
Well, I'm so glad we're having the conversation. It seems to me that you all agree that cannabis is effective now for reducing comorbidities that are associated with COVID, especially extreme COVID cases, and that cannabis is effective in reducing the stress that almost everybody is going through now, which also erodes our immune system. So we know that there's those two ways that we feel comfortable talking about cannabis. Now, Dr. Carrillo just got into this very interesting question about whether or not cannabis can help dampen the cytokine storm. And if one of you, whoever you feels most qualified, could just explain that science in a way that all of our viewers that don't have scientific training would be able to understand.
Dr. Knox, you want to take this one?
Sure, everybody piggyback where you can. Yeah, so when we are infected by a viral pathogen, for example, right, that's a very relevant example, our body mounts an immune response. It'll mount an innate immune response as well as an adaptive immune response. So we have two barriers that are innate to our body, natural to our body, to fend off these viral pathogens so they don't take a foothold, like I mentioned, and replicate and spread throughout our body. So it's actually important for our bodies to mount some degree of an immune response and recruit immune factors. Cytokines are signals that are necessary to recruit those immune factors to fight off a viral pathogen, for example. But now we're seeing what we're calling this hyper pathogen response through the cytokines. That's creating the storm. It's like a storm of inflammation. And unfortunately, that inflammatory storm can extend throughout the body. And that's one of the reasons we're seeing multi-organ system failure in a lot of these COVID-19 patients. Is just a super hyper-inflammatory response. So again, when we're talking about some of the hallmark features of phytocannabinoids, one of those being, and terpenes too, let's not leave out terpenes, being an anti-inflammatory in nature, some of them also antiviral. That's why we're starting to think that there might, be a place for cannabis, right, that treasure trove of phytochemicals, cannabinoids and terpenes, to help quell that storm or prevent that storm from happening in the first place.
That's pretty remarkable information. How solid do we think the science is speaking to this, potential power of cannabis to it sounds like, prevent and treat cytokine storm?
Well, what's needed are scavengers to go in and take up what are called the free radicals that are being produced by these cytokines and by the disease. Because, for example, I've read some of the reports of the autopsies that were done in the countries that had to face and deal with COVID-19 prior to the US. And one of the things that they discovered was that the virus attacks the red blood cell, causing kind of like a displacement or a movement of the hemoglobin, which is what is responsible for transporting oxygen. So imagine, if you will, a structure that looks like an X. And right here in the middle is where the iron is bound. An iron atom is bound there. But at the tips of my fingers and at my knuckles, you have oxygen. There are 4 oxygen molecules that latch onto that one hemoglobin. Once that's displaced and it causes the red blood cell to be destroyed, that iron now is flowing freely, causing that free radical, and we need that scavenger or a macrophage or white blood cell to come in and, like a Pac-Man, gobble it up, okay? Now, with that decrease in oxygen, because now you have 4 oxygen atoms that are unable to latch onto each one of those points, the oxygen levels drop. And now there's an inability of an exchange as you breathe in oxygen and release carbon dioxide. You've got this excess carbon dioxide in your system causing your oxygen levels to drop, and people's oxygen saturation are deteriorating. As Dr. Knox mentioned, you have a multi-system destruction because no oxygen is being transported in the blood. And by not having oxygen transporting to the blood, now your tissues are not getting the oxygen, and that's causing what's called a stress, oxidative stress, where you have additional stress. Well, there's tons of research out there demonstrating how cannabis, both CBD, THC, as well as other phytocannabinoids, address this stress oxidation, because it works kind of like a Pac-Man going through and gobbling up this excess oxidative stress that's going on, causing a rusting, if you will, of the body from the inside out.
Okay, so I think we've talked about 3 ways then that cannabis is effective as what I'm getting, right? We've got our stress reduction in terms of our psychology and emotions. We've got the reduction in comorbidities. And then we have the ability, well, the possible ability of cannabis to quell the cytokine storm. What about infectability? Do we have any good science on whether cannabis can reduce infectability? And what is that in plain language? Dr. Carrillo, do you want to take that?
Yeah, well, I would like to mention regarding to the actual research or papers that are out there regarding the treatment of patients with COVID-19 and specifically with cannabinoids. And there is just like 2 or 3 studies right now. One of them was made by the University of Lethbridge that is not peer reviewed. So I will say that what they're doing is they are exploring different types of cannabinoids, most of them CBD rich, and they are just trying to assess how these cannabinoids can reduce the immune response. But again, this is not a peer-reviewed article. They released it and because they wanted just to get the information out there. So for the scientific community, I think it's very important that when we're going to talk about scientific research, we need to know what type of publications are we looking at. So this is specific study. I mean, I know they're trying to do it because they want to find an approach or a good way to help these patients, but still not peer-reviewed, so we still don't know how important or valid could be that until it's being peer-reviewed. And there is actually, as I mentioned before, these 2 studies they are conducting for Dedi Meir in Israel. He created, he has in his laboratory, he's got certified as a Corona lab, and he's been working in these 2 studies. One, and the second one that is looking at the ACE2 receptors, more with a terpene formulation. He's using different types of terpenes. And in the first study is to use different types of compounds of the plants to try to bring down the immunitary response, because we know that CBD particularly have a specific actions on reducing and do down regulation of interleukins like interleukin 1, 2, and 6. Actually, interleukin 6 is very important in the development of this cytokine storm, and is one of the producers more damage. So talking about this and the research, we have previous research from before 2020 of researchers, even a very important research that I saw from University of South Carolina, even in 2010. He was doing a lot of different testing in different disease that they course with a lot of immunoresponse. So they were proving how CBD has a very valuable potential in treat pathologies like rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, and different types of pathologies where inflammation is really, really important, and where it's very important to have a certain level of immune suppression. The fact with the COVID is this is a virus that everybody is just, we are learning about it, so we have to be very careful in not to extrapolate the result from other studies. As I say, that in 2010 that this study, and they show that there is actually downregulation of the interleukins in certain, and they've been doing these experiments in rodents and animal models. And it's important to say that this study of the University of Lethbridge, the article that is not peer-reviewed, they are doing it in actually tissues, 3D. Still, we don't have, of course, any studies in humans. And what we have is preclinical studies. And it's very different when you have preclinical or in vitro that we're doing in animals or in tissues than when we do it in humans. So as scientists and doctors, we have to be very careful when we're talking about scientific evidence, because it's very important that people has always the right information, and to know that right now, regarding to COVID, we don't have scientific papers backing up or rejecting the use of cannabinoids. A lot of scientists are trying to build research and information, and I think that is looking very promissory. So I look in the next years to see good results or important results about this.
Thank you. Would all of you agree that it's fair to say at this point that we have solid science regarding the reduction of comorbidities and stress regarding cannabis, and that we have early indications that cannabis may be effective in reducing the infectability of the virus and potentially in helping treat the virus, but we don't have hard science, and we're really in a position of at this point needing more science before we can make that determination?
Well, in the past 10 years ago in 2010, from 2009 through 2012, I was a communicable disease director for a county health department here in the state of Florida, and I oversaw the epidemiology department. And in 2010, being involved with infectious disease and communicable diseases, I managed the STD clinic and the HIV clinic. And back in 2010, there was a paper that was published that indicated that specifically 4 types of viruses: herpes simplex virus 2, HSV2, HIV, Kaposi sarcoma associated herpes virus, the influenza virus, and the vesicular stomatis virus. Those 5 viruses, I misspoke, 5 instead of 4. Cannabis users or individuals that use cannabinoid treatments had a substantially increased viral load. And they even said that the CD4 counts would drop and their viral loads would increase. This was 2010. In 2011, they published another study showing that the use of cannabis with SIV, simian immunocompromised virus, caused an increase in the CD4 count and a decrease in the viral load, and it was beneficial. Fast forward to 2017, they've published another study showing that cannabis does benefit patients with HIV, not only because of the neuropathy that they experience because of the medications that they're on, or if they hit AIDS because it stimulates their appetite, but in 2017, they've shown that it does indeed improve their immunity and give them the ability to ward off and fight off the HIV virus or the HIV. Therefore, that's with HIV over a span of 10 years. As we've already discussed, they call it the novel coronavirus. It's novel, it's freaking new. You know, the stuff that we're learning, the stuff that we're reading is coming from countries that were ahead of us, but they're still trying to figure it out. So to stand up and say, we know the answers, or we know what's causing this pandemic, is bullshit. There's no way, we have educated guesses based on what we've experienced over the past, in my case, over the past 10 years, working and dealing with infectious diseases and then moving into the cannabis space. But, there's still a lot for us to learn. And in 5-10 years, things will come out and say, yeah, cannabis is the treatment for XYZ. But right now, we have to tread a fine line, because if we're not backed by science, and that's the biggest challenge, I'm sure all three of us on the panel as physicians get from our colleagues. Oh, I would use it, but there's not enough research. I would use it, but where's the science? I would use it, but where's the double-blind, gold standard testing? So, we are advocates, but we're also physicians, and so we have to walk, that fine line. I see you nodding your head, Dr. Knox.
Well, we don't know what we don't know. And I think when we say cannabis, we're talking about a catch-all genus of so many chemical varieties. We do not know which strain, right, which chemical profile will be more effective in doing any of these things, right? Warding off infectivity, reducing infectivity, treating that cytokine storm. We don't know. So when we say cannabis, that's very different than the phytocannabinoid or collection of phytochemicals that might be used in these particular studies. And beyond that, this is all condition specific too. All the studies that we do have that are preclinical or even clinical are on specific viruses. That novel coronavirus that we're dealing with right now could mutate into a whole, new virus next year, which has a slightly different, pathogenesis in the
already
body.
Mutated in China.
Yes. So we don't know what, we don't know how much, we don't know when, like what's the timing. There's still a lot of questions that need to be asked. And so I'm really hopeful though that this demonstrates how important cannabis research is. I'm hoping that between 2020 and 2030, we have a new decade of research. Back in the 1990s, we called the research that spun out of discovering the endocannabinoid system the decade of the brain. I hope this is the decade of the endocannabinoid system and cannabis. I hope this is just one major call to action to researchers everywhere, that there are so many unanswered questions that cannabis could have a solution for.
Well, the next question that I'm going to ask you after the one I'm going to ask you all now is going to relate to why aren't we hearing more conversation about cannabis and COVID in a serious way? I think that to sum up our conversation thus far, it would be safe to say that there are demonstrated scientific properties of cannabis that are useful in the treatment of or prevention of COVID. And there are early indications of science that it could be used in the prevention and treatment of COVID. If that's true, how come we're not hearing more conversation about that in the media? That's what I'm going to ask you next. What I'd like to ask you now, and I'll start with you, Dr. Knox, because I have you, is for each of you to just summarize what you see regarding COVID and cannabis in your own practice.
Yeah, so thankfully, we have a telemedicine practice. So COVID, right, the pandemic itself has not really reduced our ability to see patients. We already had that well established. Second to that, no, to my knowledge, our patients, the 4 doctors in my practice, our patients have not been the patients that have been hospitalized with COVID-19. So that begs the question, right? Are they coming into contact with, have they contracted it? Or have they done better in spite of them contracting? We don't have those questions, or those answers. But I will say it has changed a bit the way we have counseled. We may or may not get into smoking cannabis at this time, but we all in my family at least believe that smoking anything can cause an inflammatory reaction in the lung, right, that can actually increase the risk of infectability, right? Very acutely, there's a very acute window of irritation that can compromise our immune system. So we have been making recommendations to reduce smoking, if not completely, cease smoking. For the patients of ours who find the most benefit through smoking or vaping, the recommendation is to decrease your risk of contracting the virus. So social distancing for those patients becomes exponentially more important so that they don't contract that virus while also smoking their cannabis, thus increasing their infectability. So from my perspective, most of what we've seen is just a change in our practices, a change in our consultation practices so that we're helping mitigate the risk of these unwanted COVID-19 outcomes.
Thank you. Dr. Carrillo, what are you seeing in your practice?
Well, you know what I've seen? So far, I haven't had any patient that is positive for COVID-19. But what I find a tremendous value is in all these people that is being under lockdown. And I say a lot of people just having anxiety, panic attacks, lack of sleeping, insomnia. They're even having problems with their husbands. I mean, with the children. So people is really in a very high stage of stress. And I find, and of course you all know these, the cannabis, medical cannabis, phytocannabinoids, particularly in this case is CBD, it really works and helps these patients to calm down, to relax, to be able to sleep, to decrease the anxiety, to have panic attacks. And we all know that the lack of sleeping, the anxiety and the depression can mess up with all your endocrine system. And with the cortisol levels, all that becomes a threat for your body and makes you be more vulnerable to infections and disease. So I just find that the medical cannabis has a tremendous value in these moments of crisis, and there is a lot of people with isolation. And as Rachel said, I find also that because we all are locked down and we are doing by the phone, by Skype, telemedicine, we have a very close relationship with the patients, and it's even closer. So I do think to treat patients in these cases, it has to be a very individualized approach. Is not a recipe for everybody, and as Rachel says, there is different types, different chemobars, different genetic predisposition of the patient. So I do think that the patients right now are leaning on a lot on the doctors because they are afraid of everything. They're even afraid to go to the hospitals. So I think as for physicians, we need to be empathic, patient, and understand and be able to educate the patients because they don't know what is good, what is bad. And as Rachel said, I promote a lot all the important things, because even if the patient it doesn't feel or it doesn't have access to phytocannabinoids, to boost your endocannabinoid system through proper sleeping, proper nutrition, eating the right food, exercising, meditation. For those that cannot have access to the phytocannabinoids, there is ways that you can increase or boost your endocannabinoid system. So that will help you to protect yourself in these moments.
Thank you. Thank you. And Dr. Joe, what are you seeing in your cannabis consuming patients relative to COVID?
Well, I'm not only a physician, I'm also a patient. And last year, such as yourself, I traveled to Asia, Southeast Asia, Central America, South America. I was in Mexico, traveled all over the United States, and many of the countries that were hit the hardest, I was there. I was in Italy, I was in Tokyo, Japan, I was in China, I was in Thailand, I was in Malaysia. So I was like freaking out. But during the entire time I was traveling, I had, my medication with me. And I tested myself for the antibody and I came back negative. Thus far, of our, all of our patients, I've yet to hear one of our patients have tested positive for the COVID-19, whether it be the acute, or the antibody testing. I do, because I'm on staff with some of the medical schools as a proctor, as well as the nurse practitioner schools. I have consulted with my students on some patients that they've had in the hospital that were COVID-19 positive, and unfortunately, one of the 5 that were presented to me made it, the other 4 did not. And so in speaking with them, I've learned a lot of what they've come across and how the body has deteriorated in such a short span of time. The University of Miami is conducting a survey study where they're gathering data from cannabis users to be able to provide, and they want to see what the differences are in those of us that have been using cannabis and those of us that have not, and do a comparison in the era of COVID-19. And we've been promoting that amongst the state of Florida, the 300,000 cannabis patients that we have right now that are registered, and trying to get as much data as possible through the University of Miami to see what they come up with, upon gathering all the data that's available.
That's great news. So we now have some science being developed in response to what seems to be, from my conversations, widespread anecdotal evidence that cannabis may be effective in preventing COVID. I've been asking this question quite regularly now, and the only person who came back to me and said that they knew people who were regular cannabis consumers that had gotten COVID was talking about a dinner party that was held in Mexico City a dinner party that was held in Barcelona in conjunction with Spannabis just before Spannabis was canceled due to the COVID. And apparently it was a lot of people there, probably a couple hundred people at that dinner. There were a few people who did come down with COVID, but all of those cases were minor enough not to require hospitalization. And we're unclear, how much cannabis those attendees do or do not consume. It was impossible to track. But I think it's fair to say from my conversations that there are widespread early indications that cannabis consumers are not reporting getting COVID. And so that study from Miami, I think, is going to be hugely helpful. So given that we've been spending the better part of an hour discussing all of the evidence that there is that cannabis can be effective in preventing and treating COVID, why are we not hearing a serious conversation about it? Why has the federal government of the United States, instead of funding research into these possibilities, instead funded a study which is expressly designed to show that cannabis makes people more vulnerable to COVID? Dr. Knox, you want to take that from the top?
Sure, I can. I think right now there's been a lot of emphasis on vaccination as well as, acute treatment. And while we're beginning to do some research on the benefits of cannabis in the acute setting, I don't think we have enough yet for anybody to hang their hat on on the front lines, right? In the hospital where they're dealing with active cases day in and day out. This is, it's evolving so quickly. There's not a whole lot we even know about the coronavirus itself. So, on one end of the spectrum, I think that might be a rationale, a reason. On the other end of the spectrum, there's still a stigma. We know that. There's still this overarching stigma and fear of cannabis. And, I feel in part it's due to what has become, right, gold standard research, as well as patents on, single molecule drugs, et cetera. I think that cannabis research will crack open a lot of cans of worms. I think that cannabis research stands to disrupt medicine as we know it. And I do believe that there are people who would prefer that it not. So that's the other end of the spectrum. We might be somewhere in the middle. I don't know. But I do suspect that I know that we're still being repressed and suppressed with respect to advancing cannabis science and research, especially in the medical setting. Like I say this all the time too, cannabis has not been proven definitively harmful or even broadly harmful. And in a lot of ways, the preclinical and even some clinical studies validate exactly what we're seeing from a historical perspective, ethnobotanical perspective, and even an anecdotal perspective. We see it in our clinics. And we believe at American Cannabinoid Clinics that we have enough preclinical and clinical data to give us some latitude when we are counseling patients on using the products that are at their disposal. Somebody has to help translate the science for them now, right? So we clinicians actually cannot afford to wait until we have, a suite of trials from which to make our clinical decisions from. We have to act now. So we really need to pull in the best of both worlds. Can we start accumulating data at the clinical level so that we can inform research, while at the same time pouring in what we're learning from research and come to clinically meaningful directives now? And I think the answer is yes.
Dr. Carrillo, your thoughts?
Well, I couldn't agree more with Rachel. And actually what Joseph said about the study in Florida, it wouldn't be great. And I will encourage whomever can do it in different hospitals, because it's so easy. You just go and see the records of the patients, because it's thousands and millions of patients with COVID. So you can just go and check which ones reported to use cannabis. Of course, they're going to be, they use in a different manner, but that could give us an idea for some type of statistics. I am a professor and I am a physician, and I know that when you're going to talk to doctors, you have to talk with scientific evidence backed up and putting all out there, papers, peer-reviewed, a double-blind, placebo-controlled, all these things when you're talking to doctors, when you're teaching. So as a professor, I relate with that, but as a physician, when you have patients, I mean, you need to hear what the patient said, what their experience are. I see that is people tend to dismiss the reports of the patients, the cases of what they say. I know they are not significant as scientific evidence, but you have a bunch of patients saying, I'm using this, I'm doing this, and I'm doing well. You have to hear them because their voices are very valid, and relying on that, you don't rely on that to make decisions, but you rely on that to look further, to encourage more the research. So I just think that the easiest way to move forward to this will be do what the Dr. Rosado is doing, told me is doing they're doing in Florida. Just go to all the hospitals and start checking. It's not like a retrospective study, and it's not even that complicated, because the only thing that you have to do is to look back. The patients who had COVID, the ones, how much time they were in the hospital, which ones got with complications, which ones were using cannabis, which one knows. It's just like, and we will have beautiful data from there that we can encourage us more to do more deep investigation, more in the interleukins, into the ACE2 receptors, so we can build a proper data around this COVID that, of course, is unknown for all of us, and it's very hard to make a statement. At this point, nobody wants to make a statement on anything. I mean, not even the big pharma, not anybody. Everybody is scared and waiting to see who jumps on the water, and kind of waiting, because whomever jumps, they will attack it. And I see this in COVID, and it's funny. I'll say funny for not saying sad, but when I've seen webinars talking about COVID and cannabis, medical cannabis, and they get censored because they're talking about that. So I just think we need to keep our minds open, and medical cannabis is being proven to have a lot of value for different pathologies. We still need to keep doing research on regarding of COVID, because this is something new and we still don't have enough evidence to say anything, but I'm very excited because I see scientists from all over the world looking into this question.
Yeah, the stigma is so powerful, right? I started this this conversation by sharing how stigma prevented me from really embracing the idea that cannabis might be effective for COVID in the beginning. I was so afraid that I would make an unsupported claim and I would inadvertently reverse a lot of the progress that we've made. So even me, I've been affected by this stigma, and I'm so glad we're having the conversation for that reason. I want to be respectful of all of your time. So I'm going to go to Dr. Rosado for your last question. Dr. Rosado, I'd like you to do two things. If you could focus on what you think that we could do, what the next steps should be to drive serious cannabis COVID research forward, and then let us know a little bit about what you're up to, how our audience can keep in touch with you moving forward.
Absolutely. And I share the same challenge that you did, Steve. A few months ago, I did a global webinar, a town hall meeting, physicians and scientists from all over the world. And because at that time they were saying not to use anti-inflammatories, aspirin or steroids, because it promoted and made the conditions worse.
Oh, looks like we've lost you there for a moment, Dr. Rosado.
And then as time progressed and I started reading what stuff was happening in Israel, I'm like, you freaking moron. You've written books, you've spoken all over the world on this topic, and here you are telling people, no, wait, hold off, because yeah, it's an anti-inflammatory and it's an antioxidant, but Big Pharma says not to use NSAIDs or steroids. And here I am, like, as my grandfather used to say, preaching morality in my underwear. It's like, it's really challenging. But to take that further, in Israel, one of the studies that I came across was one of the clinical trials that they're doing is combining CBD with steroids on patients with COVID that have been hospitalized, that are in the hospital setting, to see how the combination of the CBD with the steroid is supporting the inflammation that's going on at the level of the lungs as well as the entire body. There's also another study that I read regarding terpenes and the antiviral properties of terpenes. We understand and have seen how cannabis, medical cannabis, and terpene use have blocked the replication of the hepatitis C virus, by 86%. So it stands to reason that if it is that powerful on that type of a virus, to see how the terpenes and the whole plant work on the COVID-19, but specifically looking at the terpenes. And then a third study that I saw was them using CBD kind of like in the form of an exosome, or small cell structures that are created when stem cells multiply. And so it's kind of like a honing device, like a homing missile, to go in after those organs that have been things that the original pioneers in the medical cannabis movement are already looking at and investigating. So it's impressive and heartwarming for those of us that love the plant and promote the plant and promote the whole plant for the treatment. As far as recommendations that I give to my patients, I agree with Dr. Knox regarding the combustion of cannabis. However, there is a dispensary here in town that has a handheld inhaler, kind of like an asthma inhaler, like a rescue inhaler, and they get their medication like a regular albuterol type inhaler, where you squeeze it, inhale, and they get their medication that way. So that's advantageous for that situation. Also, something else that I recommend is dry vaping, where you get a handheld vaporizer and you're able to control the temperature setting on the handheld vaporizer without mentioning any companies. You can control the temperature setting on them, and you're able to take advantage and get more of the acids and utilize more of the CBDAs, the THCA, the CBGA, as well as the CBG, which we know is 5 times as potent as CBD as an anti-inflammatory. And so being able to regulate the temperature and setting it at a lower temperature, you're able to take greater advantage. You're not combusting, but you are inhaling and getting the medication into the fastest way possible after suppositories. As far as something else that I'm involved in, I published my book on 4/20, 2019. No coincidence on that 4/20. It's in English, Hope and Healing, The Case for Cannabis, and the foreword was written by Professor Lumir Hanoush. And because I've been in Central America, South America, I'm bilingual and bicultural, I got a lot of crap from the people in Colombia, Dr. Carrillo in particular, as to why the book was not in Spanish. So in December of 2019, the book was translated by one of her countrymen into Spanish. So there you have it.
All right.
Great news.
And Dr. Carrillo, maybe you could answer that same question. You've already told us that you think that Miami study should be replicated in many other hospitals. Any other thoughts on what we should do next? And tell us what's going on with you and how we can stay in touch.
Yes, well, Steve, I think regarding to research, there's a lot way that we have to do studies and things. What we have is very preliminary, and it's very early to say that any of the studies haven't concluded yet. And the only one that we mentioned is not peer reviewed. So we are in a very early stage of research. So my word will be, let's keep working, let's keep our open mind, because I think there is a lot of potential, but we need to back it up with scientific evidence. And it's very important, the initiatives of Florida, and I hope like in the countries that is possible to do research in this matter, they can do it, because there is a lot of things that we can do regarding to this matter of COVID. And I think there is potential for phytocannabinoids in helping these patients. But as I said before, as a professor and as a doctor, we need to be backed up by scientific evidence in order to say that works or it doesn't work. So time will tell. For now, it's very important to encourage the patients to, of course, stay safe, apply all the safety measures of hygiene, boost their immune system with nutrition, with exercise. That is very, very important. Keep their weight down, and all this, try to reduce or prevent the comorbidities that are actually the potential killer for the patients, because there, as you know, there's many patients and population that contract the virus, and they're even asymptomatic, and they are they just get like a flu and nothing happens to that. But it's those patients with the comorbidities, the one who go to the intensive care unit, and the one who have the fatality. So we have to focus in the education of the people is very important, and to keep very close the relation with the patient, doctor-patient. As I said, we need to be, as doctors and as physicians, very empathic in these moments with the patients, and very patient too with our patients, and be very careful with all the misinformation, because it's a lot, you know. On a click, a person can find so many things they claim that help with the COVID or the prevent COVID, and this is it's a tremendous amount of misinformation and bad information that people needs to learn how to assess what is good, what is bad, and not start believing everything they read in internet, because that's what you have, reliable sources to assess it. And even if you don't know how to look in internet, this is the advice I give to the patients: ask to your physician. I mean, the sad part is not all the physicians are full immersed into these topics, but they are learning and seeing this. But ask to your family practitioner or to your specialist before you make any decisions. In my case, I've been working a lot in education. I am working on an educational platform to train Latin American doctors, because I do see in the States you have a lot of good programs for training doctors, and that's wonderful, because what we need right now is to, as I said, is like spread the word, and we need the scientific community to learn and know more about medical cannabis. So I've been trying to make it more formal. I am a professor of the University of Panama. I'm in charge of the scientific program for medical cannabis, and we are creating educational programs to train doctors and healthcare practitioners, and the same in Colombia. I am the president of the Colombian Medical Association for cannabinoids medicine. So with the association, we're a group of doctors from all the specialties from different parts of Colombia, and it's the same. We are moving forward with education, trying to integrate the disciplines of pharmacists, dentists, all the disciplines that are involved in medical cannabis, to explain them and train them and show them all the benefits that the phytocannabinoids and how the endocannabinoid system works. So also I've been working on I have clinics in Colombia, so I've been working in keeping up with now with the new model of telemedicine, and a lot of different projects that I'm very excited of. As I was telling you earlier, I thought this quarantine was going to be good to spend time in family and relax, but I've been finding myself busier than ever. And as you were mentioning, last year I was traveling the whole year to different continents and countries. So I thought this year I was going to be relaxing. It didn't happen, but I'm very happy it didn't happen, because I think we are at the right moment for medical cannabis. We're at a very special moment, because I see the shift in the mentality even of doctors, and I like that, and it's really encouraging me and motivates me, because I see 85-year-old doctor calling me, internal medicine, neurologist telling me, Sandra, I want to learn more about medical cannabis. I know words. Where can I get trained? How can I learn? And this is amazing, because I do see the shifting, and as Rachel was saying, and we see that this is a global trend that we have, and this is going to change the perspective of the way all doctors we see medicine.
I am so glad to hear so many doctors echoing something that I was afraid to say a few years ago, but I'm not at all afraid to say it now, which is I think that cannabis is going to be the rediscovery of therapeutic properties of cannabis, more well put, is going to rank as the most important medical discovery of all time. So I very much appreciate all of you. Dr. Knox, I'm going to let you answer our last question. It will be the same question. What are our next steps, and what are you up to? How can our viewers and listeners stay in touch with you?
Well, my next steps are to really pick up my travel game, because I am so far behind all three of you. I wish I could have said I traveled too over the last year. Oh man, awesome. All right, so I jotted some things down just so I don't miss them. So first and foremost, Dr. Rosado, I echo you. Right now, I'll say short of a boom in cannabis research, I'm really calling on industry to step up here. Form factor innovations are necessary. Aerosols is one, that sticks out to me big time with respect to the context of this COVID-19 crisis and our call to reduce, consumption of our smokables, our inhalables, if you will. So metered dose inhalers are an example of a form factor innovation that is highly relevant, and we could not have more of them at this time than we do now. And also, in the context of cannabis being considered essential, right? We're actually talking about cannabis and its use as a wellness, commodity or as medicine. So I really want the patient story to return to the forefront of this legalization movement, right? If we're saying that cannabis is essential for its therapeutic purposes, well, I really need the industry to demonstrate that it actually believes that. I want us to focus on the patients, and if not the patients, I want us to focus on creating high, consistent consistently high quality products, because whether you're recreating or medicating, the plant is pharmacologically active in the body in the same way. So our emphasis needs to be on high quality, safe products. And industry isn't alone. Like, I want to call on medical care, healthcare in general, to really understand that when we physicians or healthcare providers at large are talking about cannabis as medicine, we're really talking about the endocannabinoid system. We doctors learn anatomy and then physiology before we learn the pharmacology of substances, right? So I'm calling on all of us to preach endocannabinology as opposed to cannabis medicine, because as an endocannabinologist, you're going to specialize in cannabis medicine by default. So I want to see us start to care for the endocannabinoid system. And as Dr. Carrillo said, that includes talking about food. I mean, we didn't talk about it today, so maybe on a future episode, Steve, we can talk about cannabimimetics, right? The substances and practices that work on the endocannabinoid system similarly to phytocannabinoids, right? But that means food, herbal supplementation, detoxing, stress management, and reduction. And then I have to put on, I wrote this down so I would remember, spirituality. All right, tone, remarks, Dr. Carrillo, it's so important. I would like to see a pathway to fellowship so that we can subspecialize in endocannabinology. I'm working with the American Academy of Cannabinoid Medicine to start talking about that and start developing that pathway for us. And lastly, things that I'm up to a whole lot of things. I spend a lot of time consulting to policymakers, legislators, and regulators on cannabis medicine and the frameworks of medical programs in our states. But beyond that, my family too has gotten involved with education. We just launched Cannabis Grand Rounds last month. Our first Grand Rounds was on cannabis and viral illness, and you can find that at adventacademy.com. This month, we've departed from viral illnesses. Our subject is cannabis and autism, so definitely check those out. And then last, I'm really excited to mention that here in Portland, where I reside, we've founded an organization called the Cannabis Health Equity Movement and Coalition. And it's all about leveraging cannabis, its legalization, its taxation, its economy, and its innovations to establish pathways to health equity for all people. So we're just getting off the ground. So I hope in very short order, I'll be able to launch the organization and its mission through all of our social media platforms. And lastly, I can be found at Rachel Doc Knox on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on Instagram. I use the same handle for everything. In my family, the Knox Docs, at the Knox Docs is our IG handle, and our website is doctorsknox.com.
Thank you so much. Everybody's links and bios are on the podcast description. I appreciate all of you so very much, both for being generous with your time in this conversation, but just for being so courageous, for really being the tip of the spear in cannabis medicine at a time when there is a real reputational risk that's associated with doing that. And it is so important. I can remember a time when I couldn't have conversations like this. I was still in the stage of trying to convince every medical professional that I knew that cannabis actually had medical effect. And so to be able to get a variety of perspectives from medical professionals in a variety of different environments, this level of sophistication is just, it's a wonderful thing for me as an activist. We are going to wrap up now. A few things have become clear for me in the course of this conversation. One is that there already is good science showing that cannabis is effective for things like reducing stress and the comorbidities associated with COVID. That much is very clear. There are early indications, signs which certainly are worth pursuing, that cannabis may have potent properties to both prevent and treat COVID. We're not there. We can't say we have a cure yet, but certainly we should be moving forward with it. The other thing that I think has become clear in the course of this conversation is that stigma is so powerful. It affected me and the way I approached this conversation. It affected Dr. Rosado and the way he approached this conversation. And I'm sure that has influenced many of the conversations that our audience has had on this topic. And so I would like to invite the cannabis community globally to start having this conversation. I think there's plenty of science to justify it. I don't think that we're going to risk all of the progress that we made. And there's one question that's really burning on my mind after this conversation. How many people do you know that use cannabis on a regular basis who have suffered COVID? And if they have, how extreme has that been? You can send me the answer to those questions to Steve at stevedeangelo.com. And we will say goodbye to our guests now. You can find all of their information, their links, and their bios. I encourage you to use those links and bios. You may never have a better opportunity to get to know one of the leading cannabis medical professionals now, before the rest of the world realizes how important this medicine is and what heroes they are. Thank you all so much for being with us today.